And now an 180-degree shift in discipline. Our next speaker is an assistant professor in the Department of English at the University of Colorado. She's the author of Killing the Moonlight, Modernism in Venice, the editor and translator of Locomotrix's Selected Poetry and Prose of Emilia Rosselli, and a published contributor to numerous journals and anthologies. Please welcome UVA grad, scholar, and poet, Dr. Jennifer Scappettone.
Okay, so I've got 15 minutes to pitch my new idea. No time to waste. But I want to talk about poetry, which Shakespeare once called a chronicle of wasted time. To qualify here, the idea needs to be new, but poetry is at odds with prevailing notions of the new. In a halting staccato beat, William Carlos Williams once made the claim, "Look at what passes for the new. You will not find it there, but in despised poems." Why despised? Because in a culture that worships speed and novelty, poetry's been around as long as language has. There's nothing novel about it whatsoever, except insofar as it rearranges time. Poetry can outpace standard time, which is a relatively recent fabrication after all, or it can disrupt the apparent advancement of thought, stalling conclusions and halting, questioning metrical feet. Poetry's manipulation of time against the monotony of any metronome found an early modern expression in the emblem of Aldus Manutius, a Renaissance publisher whose revolutionary idea, half a millennium ago, was to strip the footnotes away from Dante's Divine Comedy, making the poem more akin to music than to morals, and by printing the poem in a compact italic typeface, to make books that were portable, small enough to be carried away from any desk in the hands. The printer's mark that appeared in Aldus's books of a dolphin encircling an anchor was meant to illustrate an ancient adage, festina lente, or make haste slowly. By taking away the line-by-line commentary that had begun to bog Dante's lines down in explanation, Aldus granted poetry an immediacy, a mobility, and a quickness like the dolphins, while refusing to allow the difficulty of poetry to be explained away, thereby preserving the poem's function as an anchor in time, demanding protracted thinking. Channeled into verse, language can seem to tumble and careen, or it can fold time back on itself in Baroque fashion, giving us pause as it draws attention to the sound and the materiality of our ideas. In lyric poetry, with the author of the San Francisco Renaissance, Robert Duncan, often I am permitted to return to a meadow as if it were a scene made up by the mind that is not mine, but is a made place. That is mine, it is so near to the heart. An eternal pasture folded in all thought, so that there is a hall therein that is a made place, created by light, wherefrom the shadows that are forms fall. Duncan's poem pulls us into a scene in which the archaic words therein and wherefrom become contemporary. Shadows fall because the enlightenment of poetry disobeys dawn and dusk. Its illumination is not mine, of this expiring moment alone, but of all. I am called to return to the folds of this 1956 poem over and over, its unfolding not linear but origami-like. It houses me in a music that is familiar but changed every time I revisit it, because I and the conditions of my reading are changing. Like Gertrude Stein's rose is a rose is a rose is a rose, every rose alighting in consciousness in a different moment and thereby re-arisen. Mesmerizing through repetition and rhyme, Duncan's poem invites us into a dream whose secret we see in a children's game of ring a round of roses told. In lyric, the tolling of time becomes ring-like, cyclical, as kids dance to ward off the ashes and the dusk. Caught up in this opaque music foremost rather than in its message, I don't know what Duncan's poem means any more now than I did when first transfixed by its language 15 years ago. So it helps me live. This world is not conclusion, says Emily Dickinson. Is there any room for the inconclusive tempo and bewilderment of poetic thought in an information society? 5 years ago, Steve Jobs claimed the Kindle would fail because people don't read anymore. 40% of the people in the US read 1 book or less last year, he said. Now, even a bibliophile has to admit the element of truth in this. From every corner we're offered lures and advances far more spectacular than words. The whole world used to be watching. Now it's multitasking. No one has time to pore through a chronicle of wasted time. Instead, Shakespeare's poem becomes fodder for an advertising campaign targeting those wasting too much time in meetings. And the screen offers to sell us a no-fear Shakespeare paraphrase on accounts of historic times to go, while those left cold for all of the above can take refuge in a button at the bottom of the page reading, "I'm bored." To stand out in a reading panorama of distraction, language needs to deliver a takeaway. It has to fit into a tweet. Now, Twitter is a wondrous thing, collapsing space, spreading news and ideas. But what does and doesn't fit into a tweet? I delivered a little manifesto about poetry at a conference last January. A few tweeters sat in reserved places in the back of the room. Each poet in the room had only 5 minutes to speak, so I kept my lines short and slogan-like. I pledged fidelity to the shapeliness of poetry in a world of prose, because knowledge is inseparable from the texture and pace of its approach. I said, the poet composes versus the expectation that thought knows where it's going. Knowledge is not front-loaded, though the presiding timeline of production demands it be so. It's a dawning, ambient, but non-absorptive. I said, thinking needs to found its own idiom continually to be thought. A few days later, via a Storify thread posted to Facebook, I learned that this discussion had been tweeted as kind of untweetably awesome. But strictly speaking, those sentences were short enough to tweet. So I've been thinking a lot lately about poetry and the awesomely untweetable. What's the difference? On the one hand, poetry exists in a relationship to constraint similar to that of Twitter. 14 lines in a sonnet, 10 syllables in a line, 140 characters in a tweet. Both thrive on density. Both poetry and Twitter keep time. Poems have been reminding us for centuries to carpe diem, to seize or literally to pluck the day as we would pluck roses before they die. Twitter keeps us attuned to what's happening moment by moment in hashtagable cognitive space. On the other hand, poems force those searching for an instantly legible message to stop in their tracks and dig in again and again and again and again. Such anchoring is anathema to the industrious amnesia of digital feeds that require burrowing further and further and further just to access yesterday's news. This one-word poem from 1965 by Aram Saroyan expands time and space by expanding the silence in the word for light in an instant. Even in being apprehended instantaneously, like an advertisement, Soroyan's dilated word makes room for a temporal wedge in which we dwell in puzzlement, resisting the deadening linear model of enlightenment and time. It makes the case for continuing to return to poetry in search of the awesomely untweetable. Now, while poetry moors us in time against an instantly legible soundbite, it has always existed in response to sociological and technological advances, from Aldous with his portable Dante through the futurists, who sought to liberate language in an utterly new poetry that took speed as its god. The Futurist Manifesto famously declared a racing car more beautiful than the winged victory of Samothrace, and said, "We wish to sing the praises of the man behind the steering wheel." Poetry has constantly to reinvent the wheel. In 1914, Apollinaire built on the futurist dream of a wireless imagination by taking the radial movement of radio waves from the Eiffel Tower and the surrounding noise of the modern metropolis as the model for this calligram, a poem telegram for his brother Albert across the Atlantic Ocean in Mexico. And today, at the forefront of digital technology and composing with code, electronic writers like Judd Morrissey make sentences and even tweets dance against ending on the World Wide Web. My poetry rearranges time by manipulating the directions of our attention. To reconcile today's reading tempos trained by digital navigation and scanning in a crowded visual field with a very different experience of time I had when excavating an ancient Greek garbage dump in Morgantina, Sicily, as a UVA student 20 years ago. My poem Exit 43 was conceived as a mixed media archaeology of the landfill and opera of pop-up windows. It implicates the reader in a labyrinthine search for a buried past. It comes out of research into the landscape of my childhood, an exit off of an expressway in New York, where a wire manufacturer had illegally dumped tens of thousands of tons of industrial sludge into a landfill next to my elementary school, making for air, land, and water so polluted that the Environmental Protection Agency declared the site one of the most toxic in the nation. This history was entirely invisible to the neighborhood, so the poem gives voice to buried discussions of the disaster, questioning the equivalence of industry with progress by rearranging the waste products of language, grafting bits of archaic lyric pastoral poetry onto a barrage of EPA data from research both online and on the ground, and implicating the reader into a search like some Alice in Underland, searching for meaning and following detours and dead ends. Time in this poem is not so much cyclical as vertiginous. The poems were meant for moment-by-moment improvisation in order to be read and scored for a chorus of voices. So I'm going to play a couple of fragments of recordings from my collaborative performance with the Deforme Ensemble in Rome.
Crushed them with tolls. Good many voices. Fever airs. Hundreds of vows. Hundreds
a poetic panorama that is incompletely virtual, of language both archaic and tactically out of date and new. Time in the poem lurches and loops back on itself continually as we trawl for responsibility and sense, recollecting again and again. And I'll demonstrate how this navigation works in the online version of the poem.
Rocks were incompletely intermixed. Raw, hard, transmetal, some juiced up Jersey syringe bay, or into the vomitorium exodus, which might have been borrowed from the spring effulgence.
If we make the time for poems in a culture of distractions, if we permit them to baffle us and stop us in our tracks, we just might find William Carlos Williams' words prophetic. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. Thanks.